This meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 122 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food. You've been through the reminders and all the protocol. Let's be mindful of our earpieces for our translators, and of course for those witnesses or those, I should say, folks in the room, just a reminder that there's no pictures once we've started our proceedings. A few changes, few substitutions in here today. We have Mr. Epp in for Mr. Liu. And we also have Mr. Longfield in for Mr. Jouen. So great to have you back, Lloyd, on the committee. And pursuant to Standing Order 108.2 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, October 24th, the committee is resuming its study of issues and opportunities related to railways and agriculture. And I would like to thank our witnesses who are going to be before us here today because unfortunately, because of a procedure in the House, we had to reschedule your last appearance. So thank you for being accommodating. Always great to have you back in Ottawa. Even with you brought the snow with you this time. So, but we'll talk about that and how we keep moving logistics across the country. But with us today from Canadian National Railway Company, Eric Harvey, who's General Counsel, Policy and Legislative Affairs. From Canadian Pacific, Kansas City, Nathan Caddo, Assistant Vice President, Government Affairs, and from the Railway Association of Canada, Marc Brazeau, President and Chief Executive Officer. And of course, in the second hour, colleagues, we will have an official from Transport Canada as well. So we're going to start with the Railway Associations of Canada. You have up to 5 minutes. Over to you, Mr. Brazeau.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through some of the most rugged terrain and challenging weather, Canada's railways move over $380 billion worth of commodities and consumer goods, and approximately half of Canada's exports. Grain accounts for 1/5 of Canadian Class 1 freight traffic. Canada's railways deliver the highest safety performance in North America, industry-leading environmental innovation, and strong service, and they do it at virtually the lowest costs anywhere in the world. Over the past decade, the Canadian freight rail sector's accident rate improved by 19% and the dangerous goods accident rate by 34%. Even with a capital-intensive environment, railways in Canada maintain some of the lowest freight rates worldwide, 11% lower than those in the U.S. and significantly lower rates than the ones in several European countries, Australia, Japan, and India. Let's take grain as an example. All grain starts in a truck. Grain companies charge more to farmers to truck and elevate a ton of grain than railways charge to move that same ton 1,500 kilometers from the prairies to tidewater. A CPCS study found that the implied MRE rate for regulated Canadian grain is 29% lower than the average Canadian freight rate. Un solide secteur ferroviaire est essentiel à une économie canadienne concurrentielle.
A strong rail sector is essential to a competitive Canadian economy. More than 35,000 Canadian railway workers toil day and night in difficult conditions to safely move Canadian goods to world markets. As this committee studies ways to support Canadian agriculture, we urge you to favour policies that allow for continued investment in our transportation network. Smart policies which create jobs, reduce costs for consumers, and improve agricultural supply chains are what we're going for. However, we have recently seen an increase in shipper rhetoric, as well as misguided or ill-advised regulatory measures, such as extended regulated interconnection, which jeopardize investment, efficiency, and well-paying jobs. Extended regulated interswitching gives U.S. railroads access to Canadian traffic at regulated rates, while Canadian railroads do not have the same access to U.S. traffic. This creates an uneven playing field. This means fewer full wagons for Canadian railway workers and less work for port workers if shipments are routed to Seattle instead of Vancouver. These are well-paid unionized jobs.
Vancouver train as our example, the railways have modeled the effects of extended interswitching, and we risk losing up to 44 workdays for Canadian railroaders to the U.S., equivalent to 11 crews of 2 moving one train of grain to port and returning with empties. That's why Canada's rail unions oppose extended regulated interswitching. Unifor has stated, extending the interswitching limit has opened up the Canadian rail service to unbalanced competition with U.S.-based companies. Teamsters also emphasize, and I quote, "We firmly believe that this change will lead to the exportation of valuable Canadian union jobs to the United States including those in the railway and port sectors. We thus recommend the government abandon any plans, both current and future, to expand interswitching distances in Canada, end quote. This committee should not support policies that chase jobs and investments to the U.S. Any continuation of this pilot project will put more Canadian jobs at risk. As a trading nation, Canada's reputation hinges on the reliability of its supply chains. North American supply chains have been recently experiencing labor disruption from coast to coast. As we've seen, these disputes affect not just ports and railways, they reverberate through our economy, impacting businesses and consumers alike. The Canada Labour Code needs to be amended, providing the federal government with tools to rapidly prevent or terminate a work stoppage in Canada's supply chain and impose binding arbitration when the parties are deadlocked. This will help build a resilient system that supports agriculture and the livelihoods of Canadian workers. Since 2018, CN and CPKC have invested over $1 billion in thousands of new grain hopper cars and billions more in other projects to increase capacity. Canada should promote the flow of trade, not create obstacles. The federal government must act on supply chain challenges, such as the inability to load grain in the rain at the Port of Vancouver and labor stability. We urge the committee to explore real capacity solutions, looking at proven approaches in other jurisdictions to address the issue of loading grain in the rain. Action is what's needed now. In conclusion, strategic policy changes and continued investments are crucial to ensuring Canada's position in the global market. Mr. Chair, railways are enabling our customers and the economy to grow. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Brazeau. I am going to turn to Mr. Harvey, but just before I go, Mr. Brazeau, you gave a stat, and I just want to make sure I have it right here in my notes. You said that it was 11% lower overall freight costs in Canada on railroads compared to U.S.?
Correct. And if you're carrying grain, it's 29% lower than the average Canadian freight rate.
Okay. We'll go to Mr. Harvey.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, d'avoir invité le CN.
Thank you for having invited us for
Clients dans le secteur agricole et
we'd like to stimulate the Canadian economy. As a leader in railway, the CN transports more than 300 million tons of merchandise per year in a network of more than 30 kilometers over Canada and the United States. Our goal is to transport goods in a safe way. So we export through Prince Rupert, Vancouver, Thunder Bay, and so on. These last years, the CN has invested in various means of transportation, which allowed us to increase our flexibility. We expect 750 new wagons this year, which means an investment of more than 3,500 wagons.
Made alongside the significant capital investments made by grain companies in enhancing hand-to-end grain supply chain capacity. And the results are striking. Over the past 2 decades, the amount of the prairie grain crop moved in the fall by CN has consistently increased. In fact, this year, CN set a record for September-October grain movement, breaking the 6 million ton mark for grain shipments. What used to be shipments of 375,000 tons per week in 2009 has grown to over 700,000 tons per week today. In the first week of October this year, CN set an all-time record for the most grain shipped in a single week at over 838,000 metric tons. This service performance highlights our commitment to grain movements and CN's resilience in meeting customer demand. Constant labor uncertainty has resonating effects on Canada's economy. The government should direct its attention towards all components of the supply chain as opposed to imposing regulatory burdens on specific links. This brings me to extended regulated interswitching. Under this pilot program, Canadian shippers, particularly large grain companies, are incentivized to contract with U.S. railways because they receive a regulated below-market rate. This harms Canada's economic sovereignty by diverting jobs and investment dollars south of the border. When these negative impacts were recognized in the Emerson report, extended interswitching was sunset by this very government in 2017. It was replaced with long-haul interswitching, which give access to competing railway up to 1,200 kilometers away at a market rate, and this tool remains available to all prairie grain shippers. All grain movements start in a truck, meaning farmers have choices about which grain elevator will receive their product, and by association, a choice in which railway or railways serve that elevator. CN competes fiercely with railways in both Canada and the US, with other modes of transportation, and Canadian railways are already subject to a maximum revenue entitlement governing the movement of Western grain. Average Canadian freight rates are among the lowest in the world. Policies like extended interswitching put us at an uneven playing field, and there is no evidence that the policy provides any direct financial benefit to farmers. We strongly recommend that the policy be sunset in March 2025. CN has approximately 14,000 grade crossings on its network, and almost $200 million has been spent overall to comply with Transport Canada's grade crossing regulations. When these standards were adopted in 2014, we raised concern about the high cost to be assumed by some private users. Since then, we've been working with Transport Canada to seek alternatives to limit the cost of upgrades to be assumed by farmers. We are pleased to say that with the support of provincial agricultural associations, exemptions were granted for the vast majority of the crossings, and what was once 57 last non-compliant crossings has been reduced to only 7 in Ontario and 1 in Quebec. We are confident that we will be able to find practical solutions for the limited number of grade crossings remaining. Thank you, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harvey. Obviously, those 8 are in relation to CN's crossings. Perfect. Mr. Caddo, for up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning. There are many opportunities to improve Canada's grain supply chain. One is the need for new tools in the Canada Labour Code to more effectively address labour disruptions. Another is the ongoing challenge of loading grain onto vessels when it is raining at Port of Vancouver grain terminals, a problem that does not exist, or at least not to the same extent, at other rainy ports. Cela dit, nous comprenons que le comité souhaite nous entendre aujourd'hui.
That said, we understand that the committee would like to hear from us today on extended interswitching and Transport Canada's grade crossing regulations. I'll begin with extended interswitching.
Advocates of extended interswitching argue that the policy is needed for competition. This argument is not valid. Extended interswitching does not create one new competitive option. The real motivation of shipper advocates is access to a regulated, cost-based rate, even though Canada's average rail freight rates are among the lowest anywhere in the world, and agricultural traffic is discounted by virtue of regulation under the maximum revenue entitlement. What shipper advocates fail to mention is that shippers already have regulated access to a competing rail carrier up to 1,200 kilometers away through long-haul interswitching, or LHI. LHI was created as a replacement for extended interswitching because of the unintended and harmful consequences observed when the policy was tried previously from 2014 to 17. L'interconnexion de longue distance est également plus consistante.
LHI is also more consistent with Canada's national transportation policy as articulated in Section 5 of the CTA.
Extended interswitching is the rate. The LHI rate is based on actual market rates for comparable traffic, essentially a commercial rate. This avoids the harmful market distortions caused by cost-based rate regulation, such as incentivizing the export of jobs and investment to the U.S. The evidence is clear from when extended interswitching was in place previously. The overwhelming consequence was the diversion of Canadian rail traffic to a U.S.-based rail carrier, the BNSF. We are seeing the same damaging pattern emerge under this second trial of extended interswitching. The reason is simple. Extended interswitching gives the BNSF a 160-kilometer reach into Canada to solicit traffic at a cost-based rate, while the same is not true for rail carriers for traffic in the U.S. This imbalance was one of David Emerson's key conclusions when his statutory CTA review panel studied extended interswitching and recommended that it be sunset. The 2001 CTA statutory review panel also studied expanded interswitching limits and recommended against. Cost-based rate regulation harms the long-term interests of Canadian workers, shippers, and consumers. Every carload of freight interchanged to a U.S. carrier under extended interswitching takes away the work of unionized Canadian railroaders. It also undermines private sector investment in capacity-enhancing infrastructure. CPKC competes fiercely in the market with other railways, other modes of transportation, and different routes and gateways. But competition must be on a level playing field. Canadian law should not be tilted to favor an American rail carrier at the expense of Canada. The policy should be sunset once again. The grade crossing regulations were promulgated in November 2014 by the previous Conservative government following decades of consultation by TC. The department said that it first started stakeholder consultation in 1991. The TSB had identified a serious public safety concern regarding the risk of collisions at railway crossings. In 2001, the TSB recommended that TC expedite new grade crossing regulations. Then, in 2010, the TSB added this issue to its safety watch list. Throughout the consultation, stakeholders raised concerns about the time needed and costs associated with upgrading crossings to meet the new regulatory requirements. In response, the previous Conservative government allowed a 7-year period for crossings to be upgraded. En Novembre 2021, je m'excuse, alors que le...
In November 2021, as the original deadline was approaching, the current government provided up to a 3-year extension. Crossing safety is a shared responsibility between railways and crossing owners. We have worked cooperatively, diligently, and transparently with crossing owners to achieve compliance. Who's responsible for costs will differ between crossings.
Varie selon les passages à niveau. Financial responsibility for maintenance and upgrades at private crossings is assigned by agreement or by statutory right. Landowners who have a statutory right to a crossing are not responsible for maintenance costs. Those costs are covered by the railway. In other cases, crossings exist because an adjacent landowner whose land was not bisected by the construction of the railway requested one for their benefit. The cost for these crossings is assigned according to the terms of an agreement between the landowner and the railway. If no agreement exists and there's a disagreement regarding cost apportionment, then the law provides that a landowner can seek recourse from the agency. CPKC has taken a reasonable and pragmatic approach to find a workable solution with each landowner. We were successful in the overwhelming majority of cases, and I am pleased to say today that we have completed the crossing safety upgrades required by the regulations. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cato. We'll now turn it over to questions, and I'm going to start with my Conservative colleagues. I assume, Ms. Rood, okay, you're going to start. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for being here today. This is a very important topic to our farmers, and we know our supply chains in Canada are at rock bottom, chronically short of labour, constantly disrupted, and considered embarrassing and unreliable to our trading partners. So what actions are being taken by the rail industry to assist in solving our national supply chain problems, and what suggestions might you have that are not currently being addressed by the government?
Maybe I'll start first. You know, one of the things that we have been advocating for is for government to have more tools at its disposal if, you know, during a collective bargaining, if collective bargaining fails, we believe that the federal government, through perhaps changes to the Canada Labour Code, would be given more options to act quicker. And again, you know, the best deals are had at the table, but if you can't get a deal at the table, and supply chains are crippled, we strongly believe that there needs to be a binding arbitration as an option. And, you know, looking at other jurisdictions as an example, if you look to the U.S., the Railway Labor Act, I think there's some potentially some good lessons that could be learned from the U.S. In terms of perhaps how can we change the Canada Labour Code to ensure that our supply chains continue to be fluid and we continue to meet the needs of Canadian businesses and Canadian consumers.
Anybody else want to comment?
Thank you for your question. You know, there's been recently, I think I read in the last 2 years or so, over 60 work stoppages in the Canadian supply chain. It's a very high number. We could say maybe unusual, but it remains that it happened, and it has a big impact. We want to stress that we're certainly not adverse to our employees having adequate leverage for negotiating fair working conditions. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize that the current environment and the current regime of collective bargaining under the labor code gives a leverage to certain employees in the supply chain that probably far exceeds the impact to their own employers. In other words, if you stop, for example, in recent weeks, the Port of Vancouver, not only are you affecting the operations of the Port of Vancouver, but you're also affecting the railway operations, you're affecting the operations upstream of our own customers who are also relying on the Port of Vancouver to export their commodities. So we believe that in 2024, there are other means than what we could perhaps call the traditional collective bargaining approach that could ensure that basically employees in the supply chain would be compensated fairly for their work, while at the same time perhaps not harming the economy the way it has been the case in recent years.
Thank you. Earlier this week, I asked the Minister of Agriculture if there had been a rise in rail accidents on private crossings to spur the regulatory change to private crossings, and he couldn't answer me. So do any of you know if private crossings, if any incidents have increased, rail incidents have increased on the private crossings?
I'm not aware that in recent years there's been a significant increase to accidents at rail crossings.
Sorry, my time is very short.
Oh, okay, all right. Sorry.
Were any of the rail companies consulted by the government before making this change?
We were consulted back in 2014 when the regulations were developed, yes.
So I can just add on that. The consultations, Transport Canada says that it began the consultations on these regulations back in 1991. So they actually took place over several decades, multiple governments. But the regulations were implemented in 2014 by the previous government, and there was significant consultation through that process. Cost was a major issue identified by all stakeholders through that process. So as it went through kind of the Canada Gazette 1 consultation, I think the government at the time allowed a longer period for implementation. I think it increased from 5 years to 7 years before the regulations were put in place. And then the current government extended that by up to another 3 years for certain crossings, and that decision was taken back in 2021, just as we were approaching the original deadline. So that's how we got to a deadline at the end of just last month, November of 2024.
So we know it will cost farms between $600,000 and $2 million to upgrade a private crossing to the new standards. How much does it cost the rail companies to upgrade a crossing? And do any of you know what the annual maintenance costs associated with a private crossing are?
So on that, I would say, a significant portion of the private crossings on our network are what we call 102 crossings, where there's a statutory right to a crossing. So the farmer in that case, or the adjacent landowner, would not pay any costs associated with those crossing upgrades. Those costs belong to the railway. For the other private crossings, what are referred to as 103 crossings, Section 103 of the Canada Transportation Act, there are agreements in place with those adjacent landowners. Often those agreements have been in place for decades, and those agreements typically specify the cost apportionment. So that's what determines kind of who's going to pay and to what extent for any required maintenance at the crossing.
We're at time, unfortunately, Mr. Cato, but thank you for walking us through Section 101 or 102 and 103 crossings. And it's good to certainly hear that we're down to only 8 in the country, which we know we have to keep working on. Ms. Taylor-Roy, over to you for 6 minutes.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. This is a question for CN Railway, Mr. Harvey. On the private crossings again, I understand you've been working on this, and apparently you've had 10 years. I didn't realize the regs were changed under the Conservative government in 2014, so that's a long period of time. I'm just wondering if you can expand and tell us what sort of progress you've made. In my riding of Aurora Bridges, Richmond Hill, CN crosses. Actually, I think we're working well on the Elgin Mills crossing, which is not a private one, but we also have a couple of farms towards Leslie Street that it crosses over, so I'm just curious.
Thank you for your question. As I indicated, we have on our network 14,000 grade crossings, so it's a lot of crossings. That project took considerable time. In the first part of this initiative, we had to coordinate with all road authorities, so municipalities and province, plus each private users to determine the type of usage they're making of the crossing, because depending on the type of vehicle, then it has an impact on the type of protection that will have to be installed. So, and I guess our concern from day one was the cost for the private users, what we call the 103, which are essentially the crossing under the Canada Transportation Act that are at the cost of the owner and users. And because the cost of railway equipment is very expensive, with the inflation and everything, we're now at a stage where the protection that is required on the few remaining exceeds $1 million. And this is why we applied at Transport Canada to seek an exemption for the 57 that were remaining, understanding that at those 57 you have essentially very limited use. It's either a farm crossing, so it's used from spring to fall for the purpose of our harvesting and so on, and then or otherwise some residences where people are basically using it to access their homes. So we're glad to say that of the 8 crossings, we have one where we could agree with the owner to close it. That person agreed, he found another alternative, and therefore that one is closed. Then we have 3 where we basically have agreed to apply slow orders. In other words, to have reduced the speed of our trains such that the crossing becomes compliant with the regulations. And those were essentially at 2 at residences, and one where the speed restriction was very close to a zone where the speed was already reduced, so we thought it practical. What's left is 4 crossings on the Kingston subdivision, which is the subdivision that connects Montreal to Toronto. And there, I would say we've reached out to all owners. The challenge we have is that's the corridor used by VIA, where they operate at very high speed, and therefore where it's very challenging to make them compliant. So what we're doing is we're engaging with each individual user for the purpose of establishing a temporary closure during the winter time, because we believe that they're not used during the winter, such that speed could remain what they are. And then in the spring, we would, and during the winter, we'll try to explore whether there are other alternatives. And if not, then we'll have to, I guess, pay for those upgrades. And when I say pay here, as I said in my opening remarks, CN, on our network, we invested $200 million. And for the few remaining, depending on the outcome of our engagement, we really believe that these are ideal candidates for the Railway Safety Improvement Program that Transport Canada manages.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You made great progress, but
Thank you.
10 years is a long time, and it sounds like it was a really big project with all those different players. And I just wanted to use the rest of my time, actually, Mr. Chair, to table a motion, because I know we're getting to the end of studies, and I'd like to table a motion for a study to start hopefully in the new year to do with the Canadian farmland and reimagining the future of agriculture, because we know Canadian farmland is a vital natural resource for food security, rural economies, and combating climate change. And the agricultural sector right now, we've heard many times, is facing growing challenges, urban sprawl, soil degradation, climate change, et cetera. So I think a study, and I'll circulate it, I'm not going to go through the entire motion right now, but a study basically that looks at the future of agriculture, which would present an opportunity to foster innovation, enhance ecological stewardship, and promote sustainable food systems, while making sure that we have a secure and prosperous future for all Canadian farmers and consumers. So a number of the things that I'd like to look at in the study, in which I've detailed in this motion, are evaluating the current threats to farmland, looking at sustainable agricultural practices that are in use and that could be expanded, looking at ways to make sure farmers are compensated for the contribution they're making to the environment, assessing the role of farmland in the protection of our domestic food security, and then looking at advancing environmental and economic goals, so things like carbon sequestration, emissions reductions again. And then lastly, looking at organics and plant-based agriculture as well as an opportunity for farmers with a $25 billion market opportunity, and how that can work with the transition of some farmers having to make right now because of climate change, and to a more plant-based or organic farming as well. And the idea is to engage a number of stakeholders from across the community, obviously farmers, agriculture organizations, experts, Indigenous communities, to talk about this. So I will circulate this motion, Mr. Chair, but this is a study I think would be very beneficial for all farmers across Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Taylor-Roy. There is about a minute and a half left because we do stop when you move motions. I know Mr. Longfield wanted to get in. Lloyd, you got 45 seconds for a question and maybe a 45-second response if you want to go.
Sure, thank you. And this one is likely to Mr. Brazeau. I was on the committee when the Emerson report came out. We, at the time, had some problems with winter shipments and getting through the mountains. There was grain in terminals. The farmers were having trouble getting paid for the grain that was sitting without movement. The rail lines added locomotives and added engineers so that we could not have the second delay that we had in the time that we were looking. There was one, I think, 3 years previous. Could you maybe update us on how it's gone with new locomotives and training and new hiring, I should say?
That's probably a question I'll leave to my colleagues because they have specific data on that. So,
thank you.
I can take that one quickly, Mr. Chair. So in our case at CPKC, we've been investing significantly in new capacity, including and especially in our grain supply chain in Canada. We've invested over more than $500 million in the acquisition of 5,900 new high-capacity hopper cars. When you combine those higher-capacity hopper cars with our 8,500-foot loop train model, what we call our high-efficiency product train model, we're getting more than 40% more grain on every single unit train. So that is a massive capacity lift for the Canadian grain supply chain, and we're really proud of that.
We'll have to leave it at that. Monsieur Parent, allez-y, s'il vous plaît, monsieur.
On to Mr. Perron. Good morning, Mr. Chair, and good morning to all the witnesses. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. And thank you twice, because you've shown up twice at the committee. First question is on the labor code. You've talked about the necessity of reviewing the impact of conflicts. You've talked about arbitration, and it is sometimes used, but don't you think that worker laws could be compromised over time? For example, if an owner would not make any concessions because there is an arbitration process to come up. Do you think that would not be a way to subvert conflicts?
Pour votre question.
Thank you for your question. As I said in my answer to one of your committee colleagues, we acknowledge the right of our employees to negotiate and to employ whatever leverage they can. However, what we're observing is that recently that leverage seems to go above and beyond the actual interest of the employer, and it is having an impact on the Canadian economy as a whole, sometimes for periods of time that can actually impact the GDP, and those are the kinds of analyses we've made. We have talked about mandatory arbitration. That would be an alternative. On that note, it would be interesting for a study to take place that would determine the various options. Mandatory arbitration is one, but there are perhaps other provisions that might manage their labor relations without having an impact on us. And it would allow for a broader viewpoint and to see how these kinds of regulations are treated. It's important to note, however, that the current situation is damaging or can damage our economy. That is what we are condoning. We want an intervention that would reduce those risks while also allowing our employees to get paid adequately. Thank you for that detailed response. You're talking about looking at other options, perhaps. There could be various different services. Some merchandise is essential, perhaps. Are you talking about something that would resemble, for example, what happened in the medical sector? In the United States, there's a special law that regulates the labor relations between employees and the railway companies. There's mediation and reconciliation before a strike being called out. That means that everybody works on analyzing whether the requests of both parties are reasonable. As you've just said, it would also allow us to, within the current context, broaden the definition of an essential service and see what the impacts might be on the supply chain, for example. I believe that the question is which one would be best adapted to the Canadian context. That is why we are asking for help on that regard. Sorry to interrupt you, but time is short. I'd like to hear the other witnesses on railway interconnection or interswitching, rather. You've mentioned that, if I understand correctly, the 160 kilometers is pushing trains into the States. First of all, how would it be helpful to you to have 500 kilometers? Also, with the 160 kilometers, some farmers said that they had not been, that they are not within, that 160 kilometers does not affect them. Between 160 and 500 kilometers, is it possible to have maybe some leeway? We have a minute left, and we'll get back to it later. On that note, first comment, the 500 kilometers would really hurt the Canadian railway industry. The compensation paid to railway companies would be based on costs, while all of the expenses of railway companies are based on market value merchandise. We pay our gas at market rate, for example, and we paid market rate or commercial rates for our goods. So paying under the market value would mean a reduction of safety and services and the quality of services. Another important point to note, as mentioned during our opening remarks, the cap of income that regulates the revenue that Canadian railway companies can get out of grain. It's an issue that impacts all of us in the prairies. For us, it's perplexing that we would be extending this measure or extending the distances when the industry, the farming industry in Canada, would benefit from has benefits that no other suppliers have across Canada.
I would just add to the comments of my colleagues, this debate about distance for extended interswitching. I just highlight that shippers today have access to long-haul interswitching, which is 1,200 kilometers away. That applies nationally. There are a few exceptions to it, but it applies nationally, and it's a 1,200-kilometer distance to give the shipper access to a competing carrier. The difference is the rate is based on comparable traffic.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, Mr. Cannings, up to 6 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for being here. And this is a new subject for me, so I'm trying to wrap my head around it. It seems that the main issue that you're all concerned about is competition with BNSF, who's operating under a regulation-based, a cost-based rate, and you're using average market rates. I'm going to start with Mr. Cato of CPKC. This cost-based rate that BNSF is, I assume, forced to offer because it's regulation-based, does CPKC operate under that as well? I mean, is this an American regulation?
So thank you very much for the question. So it's a Canadian regulation. It's under the Canada Transportation Act. And what it does is it creates this 160-kilometer zone in only 3 provinces, in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, where there's a cost-based rate that is applied for traffic that is interchanged to a competing carrier. So what that means for us on our network is that because we interchange with the BNSF at Coutts, Alberta, right at the border. What this Canadian regulation does is it gives the BNSF a 160-kilometer reach into Canada to solicit traffic that is exposed within that zone at a cost-based rate. So essentially, they can undercut us just marginally on the long-haul portion of the movement, and they can get that traffic. And so there's an incentive that's being created with that cost-based rate to move traffic under a competing American rail carrier.
And, over the last few years, from what I hear, both CP and CN have done very well. Your profits, according to the National Farmers Union, have tripled in the last 10 years, and CN has doubled. So how has this interswitching pilot impacted that? Would your profits be quadruple or higher if that were the case? It seems that you're doing fine. I'm just wondering why, and farmers seem to want this interswitching. So whether you say, you can do better than the United States, you're offering lower prices, it's just mysterious to me why we're having this conversation.
Well, I would say the kind of the public policy question for parliamentarians is really focused on jobs and investment in Canada. And we need a regulatory environment in Canada that facilitates investment. For our part, we've been, the railroad industry is an incredibly capital-intensive industry. We're spending now record amounts in terms of our capex. Our guidance is, we're looking at spending, up to $2.8 billion a year in terms of investment into our infrastructure for safety, for capacity enhancements. That's very important. We've also been investing, as I noted earlier, in capacity expansion, more than $500 million for those high-capacity hopper cars. We've been growing our network to enhance competition.
But again, it comes down to this question. You say that you can provide shipping at rates better than the United States, and yet farmers, shippers, seem to want to have access to interswitching to make things better, and we're in the middle of a pilot project, and you're seemingly doing fine. You're making all these new investments. I guess I'm still wondering how this would be better for farmers and shippers to get rid of this, if that's what they want, if that's what they feel they need to move their products.
It's important to remember that the farmer is not our customer. The farmer is not a shipper, right? It's typically very large grain companies that are the customer. So we've certainly seen no evidence that there's any benefit to farmers from extended interswitching. We'd be very interested to see it if there is any evidence that demonstrates that. But at the end of the day, I mean, we need to create a regulatory environment in Canada that incentivizes investment in the capacity that's going to be needed to support a growing population and economy. As the population grows in Canada, we expect demand for freight transportation will increase, and we need a regulatory environment that incentivizes investment in that capacity-enhancing infrastructure over the long term, because that is clearly what's in Canada's interest.
Well,
Time, okay.
You do have 30 seconds if you want.
Oh, I'd have 30 seconds. Okay, well, I'll just... so again, why do the shippers then want to ship through BNSF when you are offering 29% lower costs?
Well, I think that's an average based on the MRE kind of discount from average Canadian rail freight rates. I think, this is about large grain companies for the most part. It does apply to all traffic, I should say, but for the most part, they're wanting to move traffic for less. I guess we can understand the motivation,
then
but
they should do it through you, because you give them a 29% discount.
So that's the average kind of overall when you look at it.
But
Well, unfortunately,
it
we're
there.
at time. I was the peril of the chair to give that 30 seconds, but thank you, Mr. Cannings. Mr. Epp, now for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for coming back today. I'd like to begin with an estimation that APAS has calculated that the farmers in Saskatchewan paid more than $36 million last year in carbon taxes to ship their grain by rail. They're on track to do $57 million this year. From your own reporting, CN has determined that the carbon tax charges last year were $128 million and CPKC's were $102 million. So I'll just ask you to table with the committee, if you would, how much of those last two numbers were carbon tax charged to grain shipments? If you could table that with the committee. And can then you estimate since what the carbon taxes paid have been since 2019? And as the rate is forecast to increase through 2030, if you could table with the committee your estimated carbon taxes. With that, I will shift gears a bit. There's an expression that comes, I believe, out of California that goes, whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting over. And it's a bit early in the morning for whiskey. So let's talk a bit about water. What would be the federal change in either policy or legislation that prompted both railways to no longer consider themselves subject to the Ontario Drainage Act? Mr. Harvey.
None. There was no change to any legislation that prompted that. Since it's 1996, drainage facilities are considered utilities for the purpose of the Canada Transportation Act, and the cost apportionment between utility users or owners, like municipalities in this case and us, is decided by the agency on the basis of the relative benefits that both parties derive from the infrastructure.
You mentioned 1996, so that is when the Railway Act was split and was updated into the Railway Safety Act and the Canada Transport Act. And there was a clause that was not carried over that dealt actually with these specific references to drainage issues across the provinces.
Sorry, your question was referring to the 96 amendments. Because since basically for the last 28 years, there's been no change, so I thought you were...
That's correct. So the change was back in the 1990s.
Sorry about that.
So my follow-up question is, which legal eagle picked up the omission when that act was split? Was it in CP shop, your shop, or was it an RAC shop that picked up that omission? Because it's been about 5 years now that both railways have ceased to cooperate with municipalities in Ontario and farmers and landowners on drainage issues. So where was that picked up? That change in legislation back in the 90s when the railway were split up because your own behavior for 100 years, I mean, going back to my opening comment, it was 1894 is when the Ontario Drainage Act came into being. The most important piece of legislation, the very first piece, dealing with water. And so for 100 years, both national railways complied. So who picked up the change?
First of all, the issue we're talking about, I want to stress that, is only in Ontario. Okay, that's the first thing, and it's an important aspect to remember. The second thing is that, as I understand it, in 96, the policy reason behind that was simply that the federal government wanted that the regime applicable to utilities for national railways crossing the entire country would be the same in each province. So that's what happened then. Now I want to answer specifically to the recent years, because in Ontario itself, the recent cases that we have been with very specific municipalities. We're talking about maybe 2 or 3 cases.
In your case, and
right.
My own municipality.
And those cases, what I would say is this: railways are prepared to pay for the benefit they derive from drainage infrastructure. The challenge we're facing with those very specific and limited cases is that municipalities are assessing amounts to railways, and we say, look, the amount seems disproportionate to the benefit that railways derive from the infrastructure. And this is where we disagree.
Limited time here. I understand how drainage. I'm actually a farmer. So I've paid into many drainage schemes and have been subject to many engineering reports that actually determine the benefit by landowner. And I'm wearing a Great Lakes pin here, which actually takes care of most of the water in the southern part of Ontario where crossings come. And so I do believe that the rain still falls on your tracks in Ontario and on neighboring landowners' farms. So in the upkeep of drainage schemes, is it your testimony that you know that the neighboring farmers and municipalities should pay for the upkeep of drainage, because your water from your own drains must outlet into the Great Lakes at some point?
Our position is that the contribution made by municipalities and adjacent owners should become consistent with the benefit they derive from the infrastructure, just like we would contribute if we do benefit from it.
So subject to the engineering reports that are a requirement under the Ontario Drainage Act.
But to be clear, we're federally regulated, and what we're saying today is consistent with the federal framework. This is why we at CN brought a case to the CTA, because, I engaged personally with the city of Sarnia because I thought that there were perhaps better things to do than have a fight with them. However, we could not reach an agreement. So here we are. We have to seize the CTA. They will decide, and we will comply with the final decision that will come out of this process.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If there's time, I would like to respond to some of that as well.
Very quickly, we're a few. I'm going to take it probably off the third round for you guys, but yeah, go ahead, Mr. Cadenberg.
I would just underscore that this is a question of jurisdiction. We're federally regulated companies. This Parliament has created a regulatory process under the Canada Transportation Act to resolve these kinds of disputes about utility crossings. That's what they are. You deal with drainage, water needing to flow through the railway corridor. Typically, that's done by way of a culvert. So there's a process. In the vast majority of cases, we reach agreements with adjacent landowners on this. We sign an agreement that defines terms and conditions and deals with costs, and there's no issue. But in the very rare circumstances where there's a disagreement, the Parliament of Canada has created a regulatory process to resolve that dispute, and it's through the Canadian Transportation Agency.
much. I'm going to go to Mr. Lewis. I know you might split a bit of your time with Mr. Longfield, and just for the benefit of colleagues, we will come back to the Conservatives for about 2.5 minutes, and then we'll probably have one a little more round on this side. Go ahead, Tim.
Thank you. Yes, I will be splitting my time with Mr. Longfield. Thank you for all being here today. The rail companies have looked after railroad farm crossings since 1894, as my colleague mentioned. When they severed farms, they were required to find a way to let farmers cross over the railways so they can get to the other parts of their farm. In Waterloo region, I've got 15 private and farm crossings on the CN line and 12 on the CP line. The farmers are justifiably nervous. They've been told that they have to pay $600,000 to up to $2 million in cost, and that's just unacceptable for that. Farmers cannot afford a bill like that. It sounds to me like you are taking action, and I appreciate this, but it sounds like it was forced upon you, that only because. Can you, each of you, tell me what date did your company decide to walk away from that agreement since 1894? What date did you say that you weren't going to pay? And then can you tell me when you changed your mind and said you were going to work with farmers and cover those costs? Maybe I'll start with Mr. Cato.
So I would say that, nothing really has changed in terms of the legal framework that governs, cost apportionment at crossings. As I described earlier, there's really 3 types of crossings in the Canada Transportation Act. But that hasn't changed,
where's
right?
the disconnect? Because farmers and farming associations are saying you're telling them they have to pay, and now you're saying you are paying for it and moving forward, and it sounds like you're already done.
Yeah, we've completed the crossing upgrades that were required by the regulatory change in 2014. Our team has worked for 10 years now, working across the network. We've got approximately 7,000 crossings on our network in Canada. So an enormous amount of work has gone into making sure that those crossings meet the new standards.
My 12 farmers in my region on the CP line, that has anyone else reached out to them, to your knowledge? Like what they're waiting to hear back because that deadline has passed. They feel like they're not.
I would have to check specifically with those 12 that you're referring to. I'm not familiar with them, but we have worked across the network and we are in compliance with the regulations now for our crossings.
Mr. Harvey, same.
Same here. Essentially, we only have 4 left on our entire network. They're in the Kingston, yeah. So for your group, I think they're okay.
And has anyone reached out? You must have a list of those farm crossings.
You mean in terms of...
Have you reached out to say that you're under compliance? What's changed? If nothing's changed on their farm, the regulation has changed.
I can check with our public affairs group to see if this was done, and if it's not, I will recommend we do. What I can say though is that it's now like the exemption decision from Transport Canada is a public document. It's available, and for us, we're committed to work with the last 4 and see how we can develop something there.
Okay, thank you. I'll turn it over to Mr. Lloydford.
Mr. Longfield, you have 2 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Mr. Lewis. Mr. Harvey, after the 2013 Lac-Mégantic disaster, there was the regulatory review under the previous government, but no funding. In 2016, our budget had $143 million over 3 years, and we've subsequently worked on more funding for safety at level crossings. One of them is in Guelph on Elma Street. In terms of the government support of a rail line, could you maybe comment on how important it is to have continued support on capital infrastructure projects so that we don't have another Lac-Mégantic?
Thank you for your question. Certainly, I think since the Lac-Mégantic incident, both our regulators and the rail industry have been taking this seriously, and I can certainly confirm that at CN we've spent considerable time following this incident to work with TC in collaboration to develop sound regulations and implement them, even though CN was not involved in that incident.
Right. And
now,
cutting regulations isn't the answer.
On the question of financing the railway safety improvement program that has been administered at TC for many, many years is a very useful program because it provides a proponent with opportunities to have access to public fund in interest of safety. And when I say proponents, it's not only railways, but it's also, essentially public roads, municipalities, or province. And that program is a very effective one because grade crossings are the location where the traffic of roads and rail conflict, and therefore, the safest you have grade crossings, the safer you have, operations for both modes of transportation.
Mr. Harvey, we're going to leave it at that.
Okay, sorry.
Thank you so much. Monsieur Perron, 2 minutes 30 seconds.
Mr. Perron, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to get back to the crossings and the regulation from November 28th. If I understand correctly, you've said there are 7 or 8 railways that don't comply. With regards to the adaptation, I listened to what Mr. Harvey was talking about with regards to speed. He said in some private crossings where there's less traffic, the issue is different. What is your interpretation of this new regulation with regards to safety? Do you feel like the regulation was kind of applied wall-to-wall a little bit quickly, or across the board, rather? The world that railway workers live in is one of risk evaluation with regards to safety. What is the risk that exists in a specific place, and what are the necessary measures to manage those risks? If there's a law that is adopted that covers certain measures and there's 14,000 railway crossings, obviously, sooner or later, among those railway crossings, some of them will be subjected to it, although some might not be from a practical side. The requests we made, we're happy to have, reduce the number to 8 with Transport Canada, and now it's down to 4. So for the 4 crossings that are left, we're still talking about farm railway crossings where there is a very limited use, and we're still talking about investing more than $1 million. What we want to do this winter with the 4 remaining railway crossings is to explore the alternatives, either closing completely or whatever it might be. But we want to see if there's anything we can do medium term to reduce the costs. And that's your time.
Now, Mr. Can.
Now on to Mr. Cannings for 2.5 minutes.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to start with Mr. Cato again. So I'm not trying to pick on you, but hopefully if we have time and I can stop myself talking, we might have time to move on to something else. And I just want to tackle this labor issue that we've heard about. We always hear about labor disruptions. And in many cases, and in most cases that I've looked into on our railways or ports, it seems these are just as often management issues. I mean, this rail strike this summer was 2 lockouts basically at the same time from CN and CP, seemingly done to put maximum pressure on the government to force arbitration on the unions. The Vancouver port strike, which was referenced, was, we hear a lot about Vancouver port labor disputes. Well, that was the first strike in over 60 years in Vancouver. Everything else has been lockouts. And I'm just, your answers to this, your suggestions seem to be, let's change the labor laws in Canada to make it easier to force arbitration on unions in these situations. I'm just wondering if you can have any suggestions that would, involve more collaboration with unions to make them feel heard. You talk about safety, and the unions said that CPKC wanted to gut the collective agreement of all safety-critical fatigue provisions. CN wanted to implement forced relocation of workers to fill in labor shortages across the country, often for months at a time. I'm just wondering, have you been thinking of ways of involving the unions to make sure that they feel heard? Because right now it looks like you're trying to get away from their concerns.
So I would say a number of things in response to that. We've got an excellent track record of collective bargaining with our unions in Canada and the U.S. and now in Mexico, with the exception of the TCRC that was involved in the work stoppage in August. We've had, and in that case, in the 10 of the 11 last rounds of bargaining since 1993 required intervention of some form from the federal government. When you look at our 4 other unions in Canada, we've had 36 rounds of bargaining in that same period of time, and there's only been 1 work stoppage. So we have an excellent record of getting agreements at the table, and we very much want agreements at the table. We believe that that's the best outcome. But the question is, what happens when the parties are deadlocked? And when we're talking about the transportation sector, whether it's a railway or a port, it is much bigger than just a dispute between an employer and a union. The entire country's economy depends on those critical functions to keep our economy moving. So it's a question of what happens to break the deadlock. And you referenced some of the unions' statements around that. We've been, we were at the negotiating table trying to negotiate with the TCRC for a year in advance of that.
We're going to have we'll have to leave it at that. We're almost over a minute, Mr. Cannings, but I wanted to give as much time, and I think we get a bit of a sense of what the answer is. We'll go to our last round, only about 2.5 minutes because we ran over. Go ahead, Mr. Barrow.
Thanks, Chair. Just in your opening comments from both, and your wording was very similar. You were talking about the concern with extended interswitching, diverting jobs and traffic to the United States, and I was just quickly looking up the Stats Canada results. When extended interswitching was in place in the previous Conservative government from 2014 to 2017, rail shipments from Prairie Province to the U.S. destinations were around 33%. And they actually went down during the time of the period of extended interswitching. But when the extended interswitching was removed in 2017, the amount of traffic going from the Prairie Provinces to the United States actually went up to 37%, and a similar number in 2019. So I'm just curious, if you're saying that extended interswitching drives traffic, or it's an unfair advantage to the United States to drive traffic to the United States, why do those numbers actually tell the opposite? How can you square that circle where the amount of traffic went down during interswitching and actually went up when interswitching was removed?
I would say in response to that, be cautious around correlation versus causation. I think when you look at traffic that's moved on our rail network across North America, it is overwhelmingly a function of kind of macroeconomic conditions. So I think when you look at the period of 14 to 17, there was a period of relatively soft economic conditions in there, followed by more robust growth throughout North America, especially in the U.S. So looking at the kind of macro level volume, it's primarily a function of how the economy is doing.
Mr. Harvey, I saw you wanting to jump in.
Yes. What I would like to comment on that is that our numbers show that during that period of the pilot back in 14 to 17, 25% of the traffic that originated on CN and went to the U.S. went under that measure. So it's 25%. So it's a significant number for us because it was at this cost-based rate.
Yeah, just a quick question. I've had discussions with you a couple previously in my office. When you guys replace railroad ties across Saskatchewan, there are huge piles of ties. And these ties are concerns for the communities thereby, because if they ever catch fire, it's going to destroy a whole town. So I wonder what your policies are for cleaning up the used railroad ties in the communities, because it is a safety concern for communities across the country.
In short order, gentlemen, if you could.
I would say that the challenge with tie removal is that there's a limited number of disposal facilities in North America. So it's, this is an issue that needs to be managed kind of day in and day out. But the issue is that there's limited facilities to properly dispose of the ties. So it's something that we need to manage. We're always mindful of community safety. We manage it as best we can. But the issue is that the disposal facilities, making sure that it's done properly.
Thank you. I'll take the last round here. Mr. Harvey, last summer in Nova Scotia, we had a major significant rainfall event, hundreds of millimeters of rain over a short period of time, which is becoming sadly part of the new norm of kind of extreme weather. In my home community of East Hants, particularly in the community of Lance, there was concerns from residents about the ability around drainage. Now, Mr. Epp asked questions. In Nova Scotia, we don't have a similar type of provincial act that would govern that. There have been residents that have engineering backgrounds, and they've been conversing with CN on the size of the culvert to be able to move water both kind of outwards towards the river, and of course, if there's an inward flow, what that means. To the credit of CN, you guys have been good about engaging, but there is a difference of opinion about whether or not the current infrastructure is adequate to manage the certain flow of water, both from a residential side, but also the municipality is engaged as well. I've written to CN. You guys have engaged. If there is a difference of opinion of what should happen, is the next course of action either for the residents or the municipality to take that to the Canadian Transportation Agency? If there is a difference, like where are these things litigated? Is it the CTA?
I would say so, frankly. I want to say publicly, though, that I would, before you guys move there, I'd like to have a discussion with you. Like, frankly, if it's a question of the technical capacity of the structure to accommodate the water, there, I suppose there's room for discussion, especially if it was recently done. My suggestion would be that we see how it goes, that we engage collectively, and we try to find clearly it's a safety for us. So if the capacity is not there and there's a risk of washout, we will take the proper measures, no doubt.
No, and I'm happy to take that conversation offline.
Thank you.
Again, in the technical side, I'm being presented with information by my constituents. I'm also equally have those conversations kind of, I would say, with some of your senior management. So we'll have that conversation offline. Mr. Epp asked about carbon pricing and some of the costs associated. He's asked you guys to table that. My question is to the two railroads. You've talked about the maximum revenue entitlement on carbon pricing. Beyond the cost, I'm not necessarily transfixed on the actual cost, but is the entirety of the carbon price that you pay on your freight passed off to shippers? That's my question, because when we have conversations with agricultural associations in Western Canada, their assertion is, look, we understand that there will be costs passed down as a result of this policy. Their goal is saying, well, look, we're in a situation where some of that should be borne by the railroads. The concept of carbon pricing, of course, is to adjust and change behavior. I know and I appreciate that there's probably some work being done on the railroads on efficiency and fuel efficiency on cars, but if that entire price is being passed down through the supply chain, you can see how it kind of truncates the goal of what we're trying to do here, which is some of that is borne and some of that true cost is borne by the railroads. So is that actually happening? Is 100% of that carbon price being passed off through to shippers?
It's clear that a carbon tax is a cost for us, like it increases our cost of operation. So yes, we have a regime in place that essentially has for purpose allocating the cost of the carbon tax to the shippers who are triggering its payment. Because if you don't do that, and if you say, okay, we're going to lump that into our overall cost, what happens is that you will have many of our customer base who would, for example, assume a cost that is not triggered by their shipments. Simple example, the BC carbon tax. We don't charge the BC carbon tax to customers in the prairies or eastern Canada that are not triggering the carbon tax in BC. Similarly, we're not charging our U.S. customers for something that is triggered in Canada, and conversely, we don't charge Canadian shippers.
But what I'm hearing here, and again, what I'm hearing is that the entirety of the cost that is paid is being passed off to shippers, because there's an argument being made here. The concept is that the cost is actually borne to drive innovation, and if that entirety of that cost is being passed off into the supply chain, it kind of runs contrary. We're talking about a situation where we just have two railroads. And so there does beg a question at one point of whether or not parliamentarians say, well, not the entirety of that cost should be able to be passed on. It should actually be a true cost borne by the railroads to try to get around the price signal, thereby reducing emissions.
What I would say to that, I mean, a couple points. First of all, we believe rail is part of the climate change solution, right? Our emissions are about 75% less than moving freight by truck. You know, one train is the equivalent of roughly 300 trucks off the road. So we'd like to see policies that incentivize moving more freight by rail, because that is how we're all going to, that's part of the climate change solution. But specifically on carbon taxes, when we're talking about grain products regulated, our total revenue is capped in Canada for the movement of just those commodities. So part of the calculation that the agency does every year to determine the overall cap for CPKC and for CN is to look at changes in fuel cost. The MREs of it's a cap, but the formula that's used to determine it, part of it is what they call the VRCPI, the Volume-Related Composite Price Index. It's essentially an inflation calculation. One of the inputs that the agency looks at in determining that calculation each year is changes in fuel cost, including all of the taxes.
The answer is then the entirety is being passed on, and I understand.
In the case of grain, I would say that it's recovered to the extent that we're permitted by the MRE.
But the MRE does not preclude you from passing 100% of those costs on. And we can table that. I only have a little bit of time, and I don't want to test any more of the patience of my colleagues. Last piece is on interswitching. You know, look, if you're Minister Anand and you're sitting there and you have agricultural groups, and we've had them before this committee that swear by interswitching as being a important tool, even if it's not facilitated, but having it there is important to engaging both with CN and CPKC as an important tool to make sure that they do try to keep that cost competitiveness, which you guys have highlighted. Mr. Canning's talked about, of course, if the MRE does keep costs down, you know, around the U.S. piece. But if you're on it, would you simply be saying, okay, maybe, and I'm sympathetic as the chair of the Agriculture Committee about the fact that there's not reciprocity, how you as railroads don't have the access. Would the argument not be that, okay, maybe in an extended pilot beyond 25 to allow for more data, that maybe the simple change be that the American railroad does not have the same 160-kilometer radius into Canada, and that you guys in the agriculture community continues to have the 160 short-term interswitching benefit, and you guys are competing amongst yourself as Canadian railroad?
I would say there's significant data to make decisions, public policy decisions about this policy. We've got 2.5 years from the previous time that it was in place. We're now more than a year into this second pilot project. We report all the data to Transport Canada, so they've got all of the data about how it's being used. And it's the same pattern that we're seeing with this second pilot. So we would encourage the committee to look back to David Emerson's analysis on this in his 2015 statutory review report.
Just quickly, how often has it been used? Do you have the number of how often it has actually statutorily been used under the pilot right now? Do you have that numbers? And if not, could you provide to the committee quickly?
So the specific number for a specific carrier can be commercially sensitive, but what I can say is that it is being used, and it is only being used to transfer traffic to the BNSF, in our case at Coots, Alberta.
Sure. I appreciate it's commercially sensitive, but any even sense? Very limited is what we've heard from the...
No, I can only go on my colleague at CBC.
Thank you, colleagues. To our witnesses, thank you so much for your work in the railroads, and obviously a very important sector, and thank you for taking the time today to engage in this study. And colleagues, we're just going to break just for about a minute, and then we're going to have our transport officials come up, and we'll start the second round, which will be truncated. Meeting suspended. look at it for a bit of a truncated panel from the Department of Transportation. So with us here in the room is Tamara Rouge, who is the Director General, Surface Transportation Policy, and Stephen Scott, Director General of Rail Safety and Security. Again, I would extend our sympathies for last time, how we had a number of votes and we had to reschedule you. Happy to have you back, and I'll let you provide a 5-minute opening remarks from, if you have anything, from the Department of Transportation, and then we are going to turn it over probably in the last 30 minutes that we have just for questions from probably one round for each party. Maybe Ms. Rouge, if you'd like to go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I'd like to begin by acknowledging we're gathered today on the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Je m'appelle Tamara Rouge. Je suis la directrice générale des politiques de transport terrestre à transport.
I am the Director General of Surface Transportation Policy at Transport Canada. I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me today to discuss the issues and opportunities related to railways and their important role transporting goods for Canada's agricultural sector.
An efficient service, and that for many, rail remains the only practical and economical means of transporting their products to domestic and international markets. Canadian railways do operate in a complex freight rail network that connects over 400 grain elevators and moves high volumes of grain over long distances. Canada's reputation as a trading nation depends on our railways to meet the demand and deliver on time. The transportation of Western grain by rail has generally been operating well. The past crop year, the Canadian Class 1s transported more than 53 million metric tons across their networks. The car cycle times, and that's the length of time it takes a car to travel from its origin to destination and back, are regularly at or below the 5-year average for major Western grain corridors, Vancouver, Prince Rupert, and Thunder Bay. But the government continues to monitor this system performance closely, and we engage collaboratively with stakeholders to talk about the market dynamics that underpin Canada's freight rail system. And this helps inform and shape how Transport Canada and the government can consider which legislative or regulatory changes, if any, would be appropriate in ensuring Canada's freight rail system remains competitive and efficient. Now I'll turn to my colleague.
Merci, Tamara. Bon matin, Monsieur le Président et membres du comité. Merci.
Good morning, and thank you for having us here today.
I work as the Director General of Rail Safety and Security at Transport Canada. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about the regulatory regime for safe operation of railway grade crossings in Canada. In total, there are about 23,000 grade crossings across the country. This is comprised of about 14,000 public grade crossings on roads that are maintained by a municipal road authority designed for public use. The remaining 9,000 are private grade crossings, where the adjacent land is owned by private landowners, for example, businesses, farmers, and residents, and where the crossing is not intended for use by the general public. In 2014, Transport Canada introduced the Grade Crossings Regulations to improve safety at rail crossings by mandating the standards that govern their design, construction, and maintenance. This includes engineering specifications for the crossing surface, the physical barriers, the warning systems, and the signage. Recognizing that a one-size-fits-all approach would not be pragmatic nor in the interests of safety, the regulations establish a spectrum of safety measures tailored to the assessed level of risk of each individual crossing, with risk being dependent on several variables such as volume of traffic, speed, sight lines, and geography. The regulations provided up to 10 years for railways and landowners to make infrastructure upgrades and bring the rail crossings into compliance with the new safety standards. Over this period, Transport Canada has extensively engaged with stakeholders on the changes, including with farmer associations, and we are grateful for their continued involvement. In order to ensure a reasonable regulatory burden and that resources are prioritized to the highest risk areas, the regulations were amended in 2021 to permanently exempt from upgrade requirements about 3,000 of the lowest risk private grade crossings. The regulations came into full force on November 28, 2024. Information provided to Transport Canada from the railways indicates that over 99% of grade crossings are compliant with the new standards. Under the regulations, private crossing owners have a shared responsibility for safety at their crossings and have flexible options to ensure compliance with safety standards. Apportionment of financial responsibility is governed by the Canada Transportation Act which is administered by the Canadian Transportation Agency, an independent, quasi-judicial administrative tribunal with the mandate to regulate and adjudicate economic issues in the transportation sector. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much to you both, and we'll get right to that. I understand, well, first of all, Mr. Lawrence, I don't know if you remember this committee in the past, but you do have lots of agriculture in your riding, so welcome to the committee. Good to have you here, and you have 6 minutes.
Very much, Chair, and yeah, I spent some time on this committee when I was at a PMB to exempt the farmers from the carbon tax there on propane and natural gas. That continues to actually carry on these days, and so I'll note that I got a thumbs up from the chair on that. But thank you very much, and it's great to be here. So I just want to start just to get some of the background on this. So. How, of course, my understanding is, as you said there, there's about 9,000 private rail crossings, give or take. At those 9,000 private rail crossings, there's what would be the total amount, if you have it, of crossings in a year of those at those 9,000 on, like a ballpark? Or?
Sorry. Like how many would be farm crossings?
How many individuals would cross at those private rail crossings?
It really depends. So of the 9,000, there's, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the bottom 3,000 were scoped out.
Yeah. So, sorry, I think we're missing here a little bit. So there'd be hundreds of thousands of crossings at those private rail crossings in terms of there would be tractors that would go across, cars that would go across, right? And so how many incidents that occur at those private rail crossings?
So I have stats on accidents.
Perfect. Yep.
Okay. So Transport Canada uses the same data as the Transportation Safety Board, and it's publicly available. So the trend line in accidents and fatalities over the last 10 years is down, which is positive. In 2023, there were 149 crossing accidents in Canada. 33 of those were at private crossings, and 2 were at farm crossings.
Okay, so of the hundreds of thousands of crossings that occur every year at private rail crossings, we've got 33 and 2 at the farm crossings. At those 2 that occurred at the farm crossings, were they fatalities, or what was the total injury? Do you know?
So fatalities in total last year for 2023 were 13 fatalities.
Over all crossings or over private?
All crossings.
All
13.
crossings. Okay,
so
yeah,
that's down from the 10-year average, which again is positive. There were none at farm crossings.
There were none. Okay. First of all, I want to thank you. You're one of the few folks from this government who've actually had numbers at their hands. So that's some awesome work. But okay, so we've got, obviously safety is always of extreme importance, and we appreciate the work you do that. But we also have a finite amount of resources, and so we want to make sure those resources are put place where you get maximum results. And so we have two incidents, and we have 0 fatalities at farm crossings. Now, what we're hearing, and feel free to dispute this, but what we're hearing from the Ontario Federation of Agriculture is that some of these crossings to bring up to the new standards will cost farmers between $600,000 to $2 million, and then $10,000 a year in an annual maintenance fee. So this will put farms out of business. And so if we're not accomplishing anything or very little from a safety perspective, but we are putting farmers out of business, you can see where that is an issue. And at the very least, as per a letter that we were sending out, that perhaps a delay in greater further study before we start shutting down railways might be in order there. Could you comment on that?
Thank you, Chair, for the question. So I would share a couple of thoughts. So the regulations do put in place a risk-based approach, so it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. We do recognize that, and I think this is where you're going. On the whole, private grade crossings and farm crossings are part of that. Generally speaking, tend to be lower risk than the public crossings in the cities, high traffic. But that doesn't mean that all private crossings are low risk. There are some that are medium and high risk, and those are the remaining 6,000 of the 9,000 that remained as part of the regulations. And so the regulations set a spectrum-based approach. So there's kind of 5 kind of levels of risk. And where a crossing falls in that kind of spectrum determines the mitigation measures required to bring risk down to a tolerable level. In some cases, I think in the vast majority of cases, because we're at a 99% compliance rate, the measures put in place were financially reasonable. There's a small number, and the representative from CN spoke to it earlier in the first hour. They're down to 8, where there's these cost-prohibitive budgets or estimated costs between $600,000 and $2 million. And so they're working with landowners to find practical solutions for those 8, and CPKC testified that they're in full compliance. So,
thank you. So I'll just end with this. So we have a situation where we have in the farm crossings we have 2 incidents, 0 fatalities. We also have a time when the cost of, we have an affordability crisis, and the cost of food has never been higher in this country. So my strong suggestion and recommendation to your department is to indeed take that flexible approach and don't just close arbitrarily private rail crossings, which will cut off farmland, which will increase the cost of food, and perhaps drive farms out of business where there is very little, if anything, to gain from a safety perspective. Thank you very much, and once again, thank you for being so prepared. I appreciate it.
Ms. Rude, you just want to ask a very quick tabling of information. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm just wondering the statistics that you gave with regard to the fatalities. If you could table for the committee, I'd be interested to know how many of those fatalities involved a collision with a train and how many of them were just accidents or collisions that happened around a railroad track. And you can table that with the committee if you don't have that answer.
Okay. My initial reaction would be that most of them, if not all, would involve a train. That's the subset of data I have, but I'll check and table it.
Thank you very much. So what we'll do is I'm going to take the first 3 minutes. Mr. Lewis, you'll take the next 3. I know a lot of the first round of questioning to our officials was on crossings. It was, I think, refreshing and important to hear a few things in the first panel. One, that we're down to only about maybe 7 or 8 cases in the country, or at least CPKC talked about the fact that they are completely compliant and CN is very close, and that we do have a flexible approach. And certainly that this has been a process that started under the Conservative government and has been continuing on for quite some time. I want to ask about interswitching, and if I think that would be an important piece. We just heard from the 2 major railroads who were not able to share the amount of times that interswitching has been used under the pilot. I presume you would have that information. Are you able, Ms. Rudge, to be able to share how often that has actually been utilized so far in the in the time that it's been in place?
Yeah, so since September at an aggregate level, I can say that interswitching, the cars that have been interswitched is less than 1% of the total car rail movements in Canada.
And obviously, I assume this is still an assessment that's being done by Transport Canada as the information is coming in. But does the department have a view thus far about the pilot and its success, or the data that has come back thus far?
Mr. Chair, as you say, we're still assessing the pilot. The pilot's not done. The data's coming in, and we saw previously under the other 3-year extended interswitching period that actually the uptake increased over time. And so I think sometimes based on how contracts work and negotiations, the start of the pilot might have had lower usage, and then things increase over time. So I would say we're still assessing it. We are getting info from the railways on usage, and then we've also gone out to the shipper side, which was not done under the previous pilot, to do like a survey and get input from them. So we're continuing to assess the pilot.
I asked questions of the railroad in the first panel, and again, I'm supportive of carbon pricing. I've fought to make some adjustments on the national level. One of the things that I think what I was concerned about hearing is that the railroads are able to pass off the entirety of that cost, which I think kind of goes against the principle of the market mechanism serving as a way to actually incentivize reduced emissions. Is that your understanding as well, that the entirety of the cost that is incurred can be passed off, and that there is no ability under the maximum revenue entitlement to have some adjustments about what proportion of carbon pricing can be passed off to shippers? I take notice there still is a question of whether or not that benefit flows directly to farm, because these are major shippers, but that is something we hear a lot. Am I reading that situation correctly?
I think it would be for like Environment Canada, who is like the experts on carbon pricing, to explain exactly what's allowed under the policies. And then even in terms of the maximum revenue entitlement and how the costing works within that, it is quite complex. And so I do think it's the CTA that are the experts in that. So Transport's not well positioned to opine on that.
Just last quick one before I go over to Mr. Lewis. We heard from the railroads in the first panel about BSNF having access to Canadian rail networks and no symmetry in terms of Canadian railroads having those same types of principles. As Transport Canada, are you of the view that that is a valid argument? Is there something that can be done to try to create a network? Has there ever been conversations with U.S. states about allowing for the similar types of principles to be extended, taking into account that this pilot is Canadian? But anything you can provide the committee on that?
Yeah, in fact, Mr. Chair, in the U.S., they've recently introduced, it's not the same as extended interswitching, but called reciprocal switching. So it's a different approach in the U.S. where they have to a shipper would have to show a service concern before having access to that remedy. So it's a different approach in the U.S. and it's not the same. So the railways are correct saying it's not like exactly the same system.
But the Canadian railroads have access to those tools when they have those tracks?
The shippers would have access to that tool to like get a different railway, yes.
Okay.
But they can't, I guess I just want to clarify there. What's happening in Canada is through the extended interswitching pilot, they are able to kind of market a different path through the U.S. The railway doesn't really have that opportunity through the way that reciprocal switching works in the U.S. So it is different. Yeah.
Mr. Lewis, you have about just over 2 minutes. Sorry, I didn't quite get you half.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the officials from Transport Canada. I would ask the question to either of you. In the previous panel, CP Rail, CN Rail said that these private farm crossings, there's only about 8 left in the country that haven't been addressed. There are 27 in my region on that line who many haven't been notified. So whose responsibility is it to notify these farmers about any kind of modifications, closures, or have they been, now that the deadline has passed, they're concerned? Whose responsibility is that to notify them?
So under the regulations, there is information sharing requirements. So certain information is, the railways are obligated to share certain information with the landowners. I know sometimes it's not always possible to get in touch with specific landowners for logistical reasons or what have you. But if a landowner wants to contact a railway to initiate that dialogue, then they can do that. And as I said in my opening remarks, if landowners or other stakeholders need assistance in navigating that dialogue, then the Canadian Transportation Agency does provide dispute resolution, mediation, and adjudication services.
It's more the information that seems to be lacking right now. Maybe I have 2 quick questions. Have you been in touch with organizations like the Ontario Federation of Agriculture or Canadian Federation of Agriculture?
So yes. So over the last 10 years, we've had quite a comprehensive engagement strategy. There's been working group meetings, town halls, bulletins were sent to over 1,600 municipalities. The departmental website has been updated. There's been bilateral meetings, including a few weeks ago with the agriculture associations, joint seminars with the Canadian Transportation Agency, because we do recognize that the roles and responsibilities are not always clear to stakeholders, so we try to do those jointly. Mass email communication, social media notifications, just recognizing that there's 23,000 crossings across the country, so we need to do everything we can to reach people.
Is this something that the Rail Safety Improvement Program can be part of the solutions to work toward it? Is that something that can be applied here?
So the Rail Safety Improvement Program is a grant and contribution program administered by Transport Canada. It funds all types of projects, infrastructure, research, technology, education awareness projects to improve safety. Since its inception in 2016, it's funded more than 1,000 projects for a total of $230 million. The timing and theme of the next call is expected in 25-26 at the earliest, for projects starting in 26-27. So it'll be a pathway available for applicants going forward.
We're at time, Mr. Lewis. I will echo what what was your colleague who was just in here? Lawrence. I will echo what Mr. Lawrence said. Thank you to our officials. You're very well prepared today with lots of good information. Monsieur Parent, 6 minutes. Allez-y, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Perron, 6 minutes, please. Thank you. Thank you to all of the witnesses for being here this morning. Much appreciated. I'll start with the regulation of ties. You've mentioned that there are 23,000 ties across Canada. You said there are 9,000 railway crossings that need to be regulated. 3,000 were exempted. So the total of 9,000 are private crossings, is that correct?
Oui, effectivement.
Yes, indeed. The 9,000 are private crossings. Thank you, Mr. Scott. Here's another question. We received some farming groups as witnesses, and we've met with railway company folks earlier. It's been said that other measures could be implemented that would be less expensive than $600,000 to $2 million per private crossing, which is too much. Even when the farmland is not, separated into two, you still have to access it. So, given those circumstances, have you, when you've spoken to railway companies, and with regards to the CN, do you feel that they were open to these discussions?
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Regulations, it provides what I like to call a menu approach. So once an assessed level of risk of a crossing is determined, there's multiple different options for a railway or landowner to achieve compliance and reduce that risk to a tolerable level where we want to see it. In many cases, it could be achieved by vegetation clearing, adjusting the road approach so it's a little less acute to the railway to improve blind spots. In some cases, the crossing can be moved, let's say, further down the field or some other spot where sight lines are improved. And then there's also the warning systems, which tend to be the most costly ones.
Maintenant, dans les cas où c'est pas possible,
Thank you. In the case where that kind of adaptation is not possible, there is a program that exists to increase railway security. Some farming groups told us that there was no money in there. We've seen this quite often at the government level, that there are some programs and announcements, and we're being told that things are progressing, but then when you go and try to access the program, there's not enough money. I don't know who would answer, but are you aware of this situation? Is there any money? In the cases that still need to be fixed, $600,000 to $2 million for a farmer is far too much, so we need alternative measures. Are there funds, or is there another program?
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you for the question. Transport Canada has a program, the Rail Safety Improvement Program.
Projects, all sorts of projects, as I referred to earlier. It's currently fully subscribed, so the next call out is anticipated sometime in fiscal year 25-26 for projects starting in fiscal year 26-27. So it's not an immediate solution available because it's a popular program and it's fully subscribed at the moment. But applicants can apply to or can subscribe to get on the distribution list from the program to be notified of future callouts.
Merci pour vos réponses.
Thank you for your specific and honest answers. Don't you feel that there's a contradiction there? The government says that we're implementing a regulation on November 28th, 2024, and there will be some funds, and you have to comply by that date. And then the money will be there in 2025 or 2026. Don't you think that's a little bit ridiculous? Could there be a recommendation made to make the funds available as right now for those who need it? Because it doesn't seem to be a lot of railway crossings that need to be updated to begin with. So I'll share some comments here.
I would just say that there's been a 10-year implementation period, which we feel as the regulator is reasonable and balanced. The funding has been made available to applicants in the past, and there indeed have been successful applicants for crossing upgrades. My understanding, again, based on the testimony from the railways is, and including information they've provided to us, indicates that over 99% of the crossings are already compliant. So we're really just talking about the 8 that CN spoke about in the previous hour. And I think they were clear in explaining their interim approach and how they intend to move forward there.
Malheureusement, c'est juste 10 secondes.
Unfortunately, you only have 10 seconds left. All right, then give me a bit more time next time.
Maintenant, Monsieur.
Now on to Mr. Cannings for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you, and thank you both for being here today. I'm going to start with one question on crossings, and then I might expand things a bit. Recently the government, I think, spent a lot of money, $1 billion or so, getting new trains for VIA to help speed up their service along the corridor here. And now CN is requiring VIA to slow its trains to 70 kilometers an hour to every crossing in the corridor. Does Transport Canada agree that this is a safety issue?
Thank you for the question. And I think I'm appearing at the Transportation Committee next week on this issue. But yes, it is something. It is something we're monitoring. It's an important point, so it's important that you raise it. So yes, we are aware that CN is imposing some additional restrictions at grade crossings for VIA venture trains in the corridor. It affects about 300 crossings, and the net result of that is that VIA trains need to slow down when they cross these crossings, and that's adding time onto VIA's route travel times in the corridor. So we're monitoring the situation. We're requesting more empirical data from the parties to assess it ourselves and do our own due diligence review. And following the conclusion of that, if there are additional measures from a safety perspective we need to take as the regulator, we have the existing tools to be able to do that.
Okay. Well, I just want to expand this a bit too. I think a couple of years ago, the Transport Committee again prepared a report on railway safety. I think it had 33 recommendations in it. And then we came along with Bill C-33, not to be confused with the 33 recommendations, but this was the big chance this government had, the one chance to update transport in Canada. And yet none of those 33 recommendations that were in that rail safety report were acted on. I'm just wondering if you could comment on why that was. I could go through some of them. We have fatigue regulations. We have the amount of inspections that Transport Canada does. When those inspections occur, are they kind of random? Is there a risk? You do a risk analysis of endangered goods. Is that public? All these recommendations for rail safety, and I don't have to add in why we need this. We have Lac Megantic. We have the horrific runaway train incident in the Rockies at Fields a couple of years ago. I don't know, I'm surprised that the government had this opportunity, and I know you're not the government specifically, but you should be telling them, giving them advice on this, why none of these recommendations were implemented.
So first, thank you for raising the issue. It's an important issue. So the Transportation Parliamentary Committee report from 2022 was a very important report, and it was a helpful input into our continuous cycle of regulatory and policy modernization. The vast majority of the 33 recommendations have been completed, or we have actions underway to complete. The reason why you didn't see more of those in Bill C-33 is because Transport Canada, as the safety regulator, already has quite extensive legislative powers to move forward with an agenda. So additional legislative changes were not needed to push forward the vast majority of those actions in the report. There's a few I think we're still studying, but the vast majority are underway.
So you're saying you're doing this through regulation within existing legislation, and I assume, and yet we hear, we had a rail disruption this last summer where the unions were claiming most of their big issues were around safety, much of that around fatigue. They claimed, for instance, that CPCK were going to gut the safety regulations or the safety conditions for their workers around fatigue and that situation. They claimed CN was going to force workers to move across the country for months at a time. These are things that affect rail safety, and I'm just wondering what Transport Canada has done to update and strengthen those safety regulations so that railway workers and the people in communities along the tracks can be assured that things will be safe.
Thank you, Chair, for the question. So Transport Canada is certainly not involved in the labor negotiations between the railways and unions, so I can't comment on that. The part of our regulatory modernization agenda over the last number of years has been to bring in new duty and rest period rules, and they took effect in 2022 for freight and just last month for passenger railways. And those, I would call them transformative in the sense that they introduced a series of duty restrictions and fatigue management requirements in regulation for railways. The key feature there is to set a weekly and a monthly cap on the number of hours worked for employees in safety critical positions, which was new, that didn't exist before. So we feel that's a big step forward for advancing the safety agenda. Fatigue continues to be an issue. It's on the Transportation Safety Board's watch list. So we continue to look at what other measures need to be taken, but the rules that we brought in over the last couple of years, I would characterize as a positive step forward.
I'll get on your Christmas card, I hope, Richard. I gave you 7 minutes, so but good line of questioning. Thank you. Colleague. Oh, good. Yeah, I do want one. I want to put it on my fridge at home. So, colleagues, that brings us to the end of our session today, our meeting. I'd like to thank Mr. Scott and Madame Rouge for your work on behalf of the good folks at Transport Canada, and thank you for being, again, well prepared before our committee. Lots of really important information. I do have one quick bit on interswitching. Of course, notwithstanding what the railroads have said about not extending the pilot, if members of Parliament were persuaded that some form of a pilot should be extended beyond March of 2025, does it require legislation? Is it an order in council? What would the minister actually have to do in a legislative sense to extend a pilot if that was the decision of the government?
It would require legislation.
Okay. It would require legislation. Not much of that happening right now in the House, but we'll see. We'll see. There's an incentive. Colleagues, just before we break, this will probably be the last public session that we have before Christmas. So I want to wish everyone a Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Joyeux Noël, Joyeuses Fêtes.
Happy Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays.
Next week, intern, but just certainly to everyone who follows the committee and to the stakeholders who come. Hope you guys have a great break. Here's what I do want you to know. We are scheduled for Tuesday next week. Votes on estimates are lurking, and in the interest of trying to make sure we can get the work done that we want to get done before we break for Christmas, I have asked the clerk to look into a potential meeting on a Monday as opposed to a Tuesday. We don't know if that's even possible yet, but I will be connecting with all the vice chairs and representatives on the committee to make sure we can make it work. What I would like to avoid is a situation where the votes start and we're not able to actually get our work done. I know we had wanted to end on Tuesday and let people focus on their constituency work leading into the holidays. So I will be in touch with you, but just be prepared. We might be looking at a Monday date, and I'll work with you guys accordingly. If it's not possible, we'll adjust accordingly. Okay, thank you, everyone. Meeting suspended. Or meeting adjourned would be the word.
Thank you.